Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Christy Esquivel, and I'm excited to walk you through our presentation titled Standards-Based IEP Goals, Crafting Rigorous, Observable, and Measurable IEP Goals for Student Growth. Today, we will discuss the standards-based IEP process and how to craft rigorous IEP goals that are both observable and measurable and will lead to student growth. In this course, we will take a deep dive into the development of measurable annual academic goals and short-term objectives and benchmarks. Linked on the slide is the TEA question and answer document, IEP Measurable Annual Goals. There is also a link on the hyperdoc. This document provides answers to questions about IEP goals. At the conclusion of this course, you will be able to articulate the purpose and importance of measurable annual goals, identify the essential elements for developing measurable annual goals, recognize the four-step process for developing annual academic goals, state the four components of a measurable annual goal, determine situations where short-term objectives and benchmarks are required, and how to draft the intermediary steps or milestones towards accomplishing an annual goal. Before going ahead with the rest of the video, be sure you've printed the required resource materials. The link can be found on the hyperdoc you used to access this video and on this presentation slide. What is the Standards-Based IEP or SBIEP process? This process is a way to approach writing annual IEP goals that ensure involvement and progress in the students' enrolled grade level academic standards. It's based on the belief that students with disabilities can make progress on challenging goals aligned to the general education curriculum at the enrolled grade level with specially designed services and supports. Students may be accessing the curriculum at different levels of complexity or at different paces or in different ways, but they should all be working towards rigorous goals. Looking beyond the definition, throughout the SBA process, ARD committees should ask themselves, through the design of the student's IEP, how are we ensuring that the student is accessing and making progress in the general education curriculum? It's also important to understand that goals and objectives are only one portion of the entire IEP process. The IEP document is framed by state standards. This includes the PLAF, which provides justification for the chosen goals, accommodations, and/or modifications. Let's look at what federal and state laws tell us about annual goals. What's the purpose of an annual goal and why are they so important? Annual goals address the critical needs identified in the student's PLAF that are keeping the student from accessing and/or progressing in the general curriculum. They identify areas in which a student needs assistance from a special education professional. IDEA tells us that the IEP must contain a statement of measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals, designed to meet the child's need that result from the child's disability that enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. Additionally, the IEP must contain goals that meet each of the child's other educational needs that result from their disability. State guidance tells us more. The Texas Administrative Code states that to be considered a measurable annual goal, a goal must include the components of a time frame, condition, behavior, and criterion. The goal statements must describe what the student with a disability can reasonably expected to accomplish within the 12 months in the student's special education program. The goals must address the critical needs identified in the PLAF. It's important to remember that goals are not curriculum for the student, and they don't outline everything the student is expected to learn during the course of the year. The annual goals are not activities, but include skills and/or knowledge that can be both measured and mastered. Additionally, the TEA Goals Question and Answer document tells us that we must have a goal for each area in which the student qualifies and for any other critical needs identified as a result of their disability. If the student receives instruction in a special education setting, there must be a goal in that content area. If the student receives modified instruction, regardless of the setting, they must have a goal for that subject area. The best practice is to break the goal down into at least 2 objectives or benchmarks. Students who receive modifications are significantly below grade level. Objectives or benchmarks enable us to break the skill down into smaller parts. This enables us to progress monitor the skill more closely. If a student receives instruction in the ALE setting, there should be functional needs identified in the PLAF and a corresponding goal addressing this need. Additionally, if the student takes STAR Alt 2, goals must have a minimum of 2 objectives for all goals, including the functional goal. Next, we'll dive into the elements that are essential to writing meaningful, observable, and measurable annual goals. The Annual Goals Short-Term Objectives Benchmarks Essential Element document from TEA gives us the questions to ask as we develop annual goals. The second column breaks down the breadth of information needed to answer the question. So let's look at the document. Under questions to ask, we need to ask ourselves, are annual goals aligned to the PLAF? So in looking at the IEP, does it include an annual goal for each area of critical need that was identified in the PLAF? Do the areas of critical need identified in the PLAF have a corresponding goal that measures the amount of expected growth? We also need to ask, does the annual goal contain short-term objectives or benchmarks? They're only required for students taking the alternate state assessment, though we did discuss that students receiving modified instruction should probably have short-term objectives or benchmarks as a best practice. So the breadth of information needed here are these questions to ask yourself are, do the short-term objectives and benchmarks contain a time frame, condition, behavior, and criteria? Are there at least 2 short-term objectives or benchmarks for each annual goal? And do the short-term objectives or benchmarks clearly communicate the progress that is expected to occur in order to meet the annual goal? We're going to be going into the next 4 essential elements more closely. The first one is a time frame included? The second is the condition included? The condition must be provided each time the progress towards the annual goal or short-term objective or benchmark is measured. We also need to know, is there a behavior included and is there a criterion included? When internalizing this information, ask yourself, what elements are familiar to you? What elements are new to you? The first element of an annual goal is the time frame. The time frame identifies the amount of time in the goal period. For example, by the next annual ARD or from annual to annual. For graduating seniors, the time frame might be less. It might be by the end of, say, the 25-26 school year. The conditions describe what the specific resources needed for a student to reach the goal. They must be aligned with the supports, services, and strategies outlined in the PLAF. These conditions outline or explain what facilitates learning for the student and should relate to the behavior being measured. For example, a goal relating to reading comprehension may require the use of a support such as graphic organizer, sentence stems, or guiding questions. Conditions listed in the goal must be utilized each time the goal is measured so that progress can be repeatedly measured over time in the same way. The conditions must be specific and should not be generic statements such as using the accommodations listed on the accommodations page or with accommodations and/or modifications. An example of the condition would be by the next annual ARD, after reading an instructional level literary text with a teacher-selected support, examples are graphic organizers, sentence starters, or guiding questions, and 5 questions, multiple choice or short answer, about the key details from the text, Christy will. The behavior component is the action that we expect the student to do. The behavior clearly identifies the performance as being monitored. It's aligned to the critical need and the baseline documented in the PLAF. The behavior must be observable and measurable. For example, by the next annual ARD, after reading an instructional level literary text with teacher-selected supports, graphic organizers, sentence starters, or guiding questions, and 5 questions, multiple choice or short answer, about the key details from the text, Christy will identify the key details. The last component is the criterion. The criterion identifies how much, how often, or to what standard the behavior must occur in order to demonstrate that the goal has been achieved. It specifies the amount of growth that we expect the student to make over the course of the IEP year. It must be aligned with the baseline data in the FLAF. For example, by the next annual ARD, after reading an instructional level literary text with a teacher-selected support, a graphic organizer, sentence starters, or guiding questions, and 5 questions, multiple choice or short answer, about the key details from the text, Christy will identify the key details with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials. The criterion should not be equated with the passing standard, so 70%, or with a student's class grade. Sometimes goals need to be broken down into short-term objectives or benchmarks. The purpose of these short-term objectives or benchmarks is to enable those involved with the student's educational programming to determine how well the student is progressing towards achieving the annual goal. They are the intermediary steps or milestones towards accomplishing an annual goal. They include the same 4 components of a goal, but the time frame is usually less than the annual goal and documents how a student is expected to progress throughout the year, leading towards the attainment of the goal. At least 2 short-term objectives or benchmarks are required for students who take alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards, and for any student whose IEP team determines they are needed. They should not describe the entire scope and sequence of the curriculum, but rather they are measurable and observable statements of the knowledge and skills the student needs to achieve the annual goal. When might an ARD committee determine that short-term objectives or benchmarks are needed for a student that doesn't take an alternate assessment? As best practice, short-term objectives or benchmarks are recommended for students who are significantly below grade level, so served in a resource or setting or receive modifications. They allow us to more closely monitor the student's progress and determine how well the student is progressing towards achieving the annual goal. This can give us time to revise a goal that may not be appropriate for the student. We said that short-term objectives or benchmarks are the intermediary steps towards mastering an annual IEP goal. When crafting short-term objectives or benchmarks, the time frame, condition, behavior, and/or the criterion for mastery can all be adjusted. Here's an example of adjusting the conditions and mastery criteria in the objectives. Our annual goal is, by the next annual ARD, after reading an instructional level literary text with a teacher-selected support, so a graphic organizer, sentence starters, or guiding questions, and 5 questions, multiple choice or short answer, about key details from the text, Christy will identify the key details with 80% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials. By the end of the first quarter, we're going to add to those conditions. We're going to add 3 prompts, and we're going to expect the student to identify the key details with 60% accuracy in 4 out of 5 trials. By the end of the second 9 weeks, we're still going to give 3 prompts, but we're going to expect that mastery criteria to raise to 80% accuracy. By the end of the third quarter, we're going to wean away that prompt support to 1 prompt and still keep the accuracy at 80% in 4 out of 5 trials. Notice that the annual goal the student is expected to achieve doesn't have any prompts, and it's still the 80% accuracy that we determined from our baseline information. One of the resources that you printed before you started the video is the Essential Elements activity. Please pause the video and complete the activity. It's very short. The exercise should take you about 1 to 3 minutes to complete. When you're ready, come back and resume the video. Let's go over the answers. What identifies the performance that's being monitored? It represents the action that can be directly observed and measured. That would be the behavior. What describes the specific resources that must be present for a student to reach the goal and should outline or explain what facilitates learning for the student? The conditions do that. What identifies the amount of time in the goal period and is usually specified in the number of weeks or a certain date for completion? That's the time frame. identifies how much, how often, or to what standard the behavior must occur in order to demonstrate that the goal has been achieved, and it specifies the amount of growth expected. That would be our criteria. Short-term objectives or benchmarks are the intermediary steps or milestones towards achieving the annual goal. Short-term objectives or benchmarks include the same 4 components of a goal. However, the time frame is less than the annual goal and documents how a student is expected to progress throughout the year, leading to the attainment of the annual goal. Short-term objectives and benchmarks are required for students who take alternate assessments based on alternate achievement standards. For students who take alternate assessments, at least 2 short-term objectives or benchmarks for each annual goal must be included. Short-term objectives or benchmarks may be written for any student whose ARD committee determines they're needed. True or false? That's true. Now that we've talked about the legal aspect of when goals are needed and what information a goal must contain, let's move on to a process to determine the content of our goals. The 4-step process is a way to help you build the goal. Starting with the information in the student's PLAF, look at the content standards to determine where a student will struggle with the curriculum or where they have gaps. Look at the adaptations or the accommodations and/or modifications that the student requires to be able to make progress. Finally, decide how the behavior will be measured. So step 1 is the PLAF. The PLAF is the foundation for the rest of the IEP. Information is provided in the initial evaluation and re-evaluation that leads to developing the PLAF. In the years between evaluations, special education teachers will provide current data for the PLAF. Once the ARD committee determines that a student has a disability, the PLAF identifies the critical areas of need resulting from the disability. The ARD committee must determine how the disability and the critical needs impact the student's access and progress in the general education curriculum. The first step of the process of developing an annual goal is for the ARD committee to understand the disability and how it impacts learning. To summarize step 1, the first step of the process of developing an annual goal is for the ARD committee to understand the disability and how it impacts the student's learning. It will be difficult to determine how the disability impacts the curriculum unless the ARD committee knows what the content standards are and where in the curriculum will the student encounter barriers. This really highlights the need for collaboration between the general education teacher and the special education teacher. A common misperception about annual goals and short-term objectives and benchmarks is that they outline what the student will be taught. The TEKS are the curriculum that the state of Texas that outlines what will be taught. The purpose of the annual goal or short-term objective is to identify skills for the student to master, for the students to be able to access and make progress in that enrolled grade level curriculum. One question I often hear is, do we just restate the standards? The answer is no. A standard-based goal should align with the enrolled grade level TEKS, but it's not simply a restatement of that standard. We use the PLAF to customize the standard to the student's unique needs. Some common barriers at this step include writing goals that just restate the TEK, limited content knowledge, or not having enough student data to identify the strengths and needs. Electronic IEP systems can also lead to what looks like a cookie-cutter approach. Remember, goals should always address the student's prioritized need. If you're using Goalbook, always revise the goal so that it's individualized to the student. Step 3 is all about the adaptations. Here we ask, does the student require adaptations to the curriculum as a result of their disability? This is where we distinguish between accommodations, or the how, and modifications, the what. The ARD committee should never assume that a particular strategy is always one or the other. Adaptations differ by grade level and by subject. They also have long-term implications for student access and progress. Now we're ready for step 4, measurement. Every annual goal must be measurable, and that starts with baseline information from the PLAF. If we don't know where a student began, it's impossible to measure progress. Pause the video here and complete your academic learning check. When you're ready, come back to continue. Let's go over the answers. Goals are not a student's curriculum, nor do they outline everything the student is expected to learn during a school year. A standards-based goal is aligned to the enrolled grade level standard. It's not simply a restatement of the grade level standard. Other information which is obtained from the PLAF is used to customize it to the student's needs and is outlined in the required components of an annual goal. Step 1 in the process involves student data in the PLAF, including the disability condition and impact and needs. Step 2 is the content standards. Step 3 are the adaptations, and step 4 is measurement. Let's look at a sample PLAF. Please note, this is an excerpt from TEA. It's not organized in the way that we organize the PLAF in SameGoal. The PLAF example presented in this training is an excerpt, not an exemplar. This example simply models the information needed to write your own PLAF statements. These examples should not be used for your own students' PLAF statements. Please pause the video to read Johnny's PLAF excerpt. Okay, let's review. Johnny is a 5th grade student with a specific learning disability in reading comprehension, particularly with vocabulary acquisition. When he's given extra time and vocabulary supports, he can answer comprehension questions with 85% accuracy. Without those supports, his accuracy drops to 60%. Because vocabulary and comprehension are so foundational, his disability affects progress across content areas like math, science, and social studies. Now let's apply our 4-step process using Johnny's example. Remember, step 1, we identify the disability, the critical areas of need, and how access and progress are impacted. In step 2, we consider where the barriers exist in the standards. In step 3, we identify the adaptations required. And in step 4, we make sure there's baseline data so progress can be measured over time. So step 1, we identify Johnny's disability, a specific learning disability in reading comprehension. His critical areas of need are vocabulary and independent reading and comprehending text. His disability impacts his ability to access and progress in the enrolled grade level curriculum, especially when content vocabulary is complex or he's expected to independently read grade level textbooks or other passages. In step 2, we pinpoint the standards impacted by Johnny's disability. His specific learning disability in the area of reading comprehension impacts content standards related to vocabulary and comprehending text, including literary elements, genres, and author's purpose. Listed are the specific content standards or skills that are impacted by his disability. How could subjects other than ELAR be impacted by Johnny's disability? In step 3, we identify the adaptations Johnny needs to access the curriculum. These include explicitly pre-teaching of vocabulary, embedding vocabulary supports, simplifying text, orally administrating tests, and allowing a dictionary. These supports allow him to demonstrate comprehension even when the text is challenging. Step 4 focuses on the baseline data. For Johnny, baseline data show that with supports, he performs at 85%. Without them, he's at 60%. This gives us a clear starting point to measure his progress throughout the year. Now, let's use Johnny's data to craft a measurable annual ELAR goal. So our time frame, by the next annual ARD, the condition, when vocabulary is pre-taught through explicit instruction and word learning strategies, and the test is administered orally. The behavior, Johnny will answer comprehension questions. So inferencing, figurative language, comparing and contrasting, and sequential order. The criterion, as evidenced by averaging 80% accuracy on the comprehension questions of teacher-made tests. Based on its baseline, we set an expected criterion of 85%. Over time, we'll adjust the conditions, gradually releasing the supports so that Johnny can demonstrate more independence while maintaining that same level of accuracy. Although Johnny doesn't take an alternate assessment, his ARD committee can still decide to include short-term objectives and benchmarks. For example, by the end of the second grading period, Johnny should reach 90% accuracy with full supports. By the end of the third grading period, the conditions and the criterion change, but the behavior remains the same. As the embedded vocabulary supports and the simplified vocabulary are weaned away, Johnny's level of accuracy decreases. This temporary dip in accuracy is expected as the level of independence increases. It doesn't mean that there's documented regression. We've taken away some of the supports Johnny needed to perform the skill at 85% accuracy. By the end of the year, the goal is 85% accuracy with fewer supports, showing increased independence. Remember, if you include objectives or benchmarks, you must have at least 2. Many teachers find it easier to write 3 to correspond with our 4 quarters. EA offers a resource to evaluate the annual goals and short-term objectives essential elements. Make sure our goals meet district expectations. We can use a rubric. I have linked it on the hyperdoc and on this presentation slide. The first 2 columns correspond to the goals essential elements document that we discussed earlier. The first column is the question to ask yourself, and the second column is the breadth of information needed to answer the question. The goal is then scored 0 to 2 points. This helps evaluate the presence of all the required components and ensures that the goals are measurable and aligned to the student's need. This document is just one of the resources that can be used to evaluate goals and short-term objectives that you've written so that you can set your own goals for self-improvement. Now, let's connect this process to tools like Goalbook and Polaris. Goalbook is used by inclusion and resource teachers. The program allows us to search goals by keyword, subject, grade, or strand, or by using the goal index. You have to remember, goals must always be individualized based on the information in the PLAF. The goal levels can be adjusted based on the conditions, the behavior, or the mastery criteria. It's also important to note that Goalbook doesn't always write the 4 conditions in the order which we have presented them here. Though the law doesn't stipulate the 4 conditions must be written in a particular order, we have found that TEA's interpretation of the 4 required components in our goal changes if the goals are not written as time frame, conditions, behavior, criterion. Polaris is used by ALE teachers to create personalized learning plans tailored to meet the unique needs of each student. It's paired with ULS, and the more data that's entered, the more individualized the information it provides will be. Both of these programs were selected to make it easier for teachers to craft IEPs that are meaningful, measurable, and legally compliant. Remember, the information provided from these resources must be individualized to the student. It's also a district expectation that these programs be used. As we wrap up, take a few minutes to reflect. What are your key takeaways from today's session? Did anything surprise you? How can you take what you've learned today and apply it to your own practice? Do you still have questions? If so, please use the self-paced goals Q&A document that's linked on the hyperdoc and on this slide. I will monitor the Q&A weekly and provide answers to questions. If your question is really time sensitive, you may also email me directly at cesqui@neisd.net. Finally, please scan the QR code to share your feedback. Your input helps us develop future professional development sessions. Thanks for watching and for your commitment to writing meaningful, standards-based IEP goals. Please return to Eduphoria to complete the quiz in order to receive credit for the course.